Welcome to session 2 of Understanding Anger 2.0. I'm very happy to have all of you here, and we'll be looking at Platonic discussions and texts that have to do with the complicated emotion of anger in this. So if you're new to being in this class, this is looking at discussions of anger in a variety of different genres. So philosophy, literature, also including poetry, drama, and novels. We'll be getting to some Greek poetry later on in the year. Religious thought, not so much this year, but perhaps next year, and even some early medical thought as well that has to do with anger. You notice that I'm the only person on camera at this point. That's because we're recording this, so other people can participate in it later on, but we'll go on camera towards the end of the event. Right now, you can communicate through the chat, and afterwards, once we get through all this material, we'll open up video and mic for those who are participating here. Now, this is our first session on Plato's dialogues, and if you've read much Plato, you might know that, there's a, let's call it semi-systematic discussion of something that's like anger, encompassing anger, often a synonym for anger that we call thumos in the Republic, Book 4, and in a few other places connected with the tripartite soul. We're really not going to be talking about that psychology here. We're going to do that a lot more in the next session, but it's worth, realizing that that's in the background, and that the Platonic tradition isn't just Plato. It's going to influence all these other thinkers that we call Platonists, whether Middle Platonists or Neoplatonists, and it's going to trickle into a lot of Christian Greek thought in the early era of Christianity, where they are using Plato's psychology quite a bit. So we're going to be looking at that a bit more next session. This session, we are going to be looking at depictions of and discussions of anger, primarily in the texts that you could say are most central to this, like the Apology, the Euthyphro, the Protagoras, the Gorgias, and Republic, Book 1, and other bits of the Republic as well. And Plato doesn't work out a systematic theory of anger that's articulated just in one text. As a matter of fact, we're not going to see anything, in surviving literature like that until we get to people much later on, like Plutarch's On Anger, a Stoic text, or rather Seneca's On Anger, which is a Stoic text, Plutarch's On Controlling Anger, which is a Middle Platonist text, and a few others as well. But Plato's going to be mentioning anger quite a bit in ways that I think can be very useful for us understanding that emotion in our own time, in the present. You're going to see a lot of interesting applications that hopefully we can get some good discussion going about. And so, we don't want to expect that we're going to get a systematic, once and for all Platonic answer. Instead, we got to kind of work out a composite and see how we can fit these parts together. And we'll get, sort of an incomplete answer about what's going on in Plato's text. So first, where is anger mentioned in terms of someone getting angry? We want to be really careful as readers not to just think that because of the way people are talking to each other, for example, in the Gorgias, which to many probably seems a very anger-filled dialogue, the way these people are talking, or Republic Book 1, we don't want to just assume that people are motivated by anger. It could also be a kind of contentiousness, desire to win that the Greeks called philonikia, desire to conquer, to have victory. Could be aggressiveness on their part. They could just be kind of gruff people. They could be contemptuous of their interlocutors. They could be what we might call a hubristic person, somebody who naturally tends to wound others in the ways that they behave. And so what we want to do is look for references or mentions of what we can call an anger vocabulary. So anger in ancient Greek, there's two terms that we typically associate it with it. One is thumos, which, like I mentioned, we'll talk a lot more about in the next class session devoted to the Republic and Phaedrus and Timaeus and places like that. The other is orge, and orge means like the emotion, the passion of anger. Thumos is a little bit broader typically, but sometimes used synonymously with it. As we mentioned in the last class, there's all sorts of other vocabulary that gets used as well. The Iliad begins with a word that doesn't get mentioned all that much, manus, right? There's all sorts of other nouns and verbs. So anagnoctane gets used quite a bit in Plato. So does halapainen, which comes from the word halapos, which means difficult, but in used as a verb, it means something like to get upset, to get angry, to start, getting aggressive with other people. There's also achthomesthai, which has a sense of being angry, and there's other words as well. So what we want to do is, when we're looking at the Greek text, if we can do that, we want to see whether these words are being used, whether people are being said to be angry, or whether it's something else that's going on. And, so a prime example of this is Socrates' old accusers in the Apology. We're going to talk about them quite a bit. In the Euthyphro, he mentions his fellow Athenians. This is right before the Apology, right? We have Anytus in the Meno showing up. He's one of Socrates' younger accusers, and he gets pissed off at Socrates and starts threatening him. We have, of course, Thrasymachus early on in the Republic, and we have another mention of another guy getting angry in the Republic, a story that's being told. Now, interestingly, we also have a case where it's often translated with Callicles telling Socrates, don't get angry at me, man. Don't get upset with me. And we're going to look at that a little bit more closely. Is it really anger? Is it not in one of the most angry dialogues? So we're going to look at those shortly. And it's worth mentioning that anger does come up in a few other dialogues. So this guy Critias in the Charmides gets angry. Xapis gets angry in the Eudemus, in the Lysias, the tutors who are supposed to be watching over the young men, they're drunk, they get angry as well. And there's other people who are coming up. Now, we can also ask, where are we getting discussions of causes for anger? And this is where we start to get to the stuff that's more useful and perhaps more interesting, right? So we know that some people are more inclined to anger or other associated drives like striving after honors, wanting to win, right? Being aggressive, contentiousness, being ready to fight other people. And again, we're going to discuss that more in the next session when we get to talking about thumos and the tripartite soul. But we can also say that there are some situations that are liable to make a person more vulnerable to anger. One of the texts we're not really going to look at here, but is worth a mention, and I think we can probably all relate to some degree, or, we can remember other people who behave this way. When a person is motivated by love or erotic desire, eros, then love makes them quarrelsome, and not just with everybody else, also with their lover or beloved, right? And so that makes them more liable to anger. But we can think of all sorts of other things that get people angry. Snickers made a great set of commercials about being hangry a while back. Somebody would be saying mean things, like somebody would say they were a model, they'd be like, yeah, hand model. And then, they get a Snickers bar and they eat it, and now they're not so upset anymore, right? So that's kind of an interesting idea. And, in general, this is a theme that's going to come up over and over and over again in all of the literature that we're looking at. People tend to get angry when they think that they themselves or people or things that they value are being wronged or insulted or treated badly or unfairly. And Plato mentions this at certain points, but I think he just kind of assumes it in the background a lot of the time. He's not going to thematize it quite so much as later thinkers will. There are, however, in the text that we're going to look at, some really, really interesting and I think useful discussions that we can piece together about people getting angry in the course of discussing matters with other people. So this is where the real payoff, I think, for this session is going to lie, in looking at these texts like the Euthyphro and the Gorgias, the Protagoras, and a few others, and deriving what we might call a non-systematic but general set of guidelines about, why it is that people do get upset with each other in discussions. There's also another thing that we're going to talk about, which is people getting angry with other people over their character flaws or their bad decisions and commitments. And the word thumos is, in fact, used there. Now, it's put in the mouth of Protagoras rather than Socrates or, the Athenian stranger or anybody like that. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about saying that that's Plato's own point of view. But there's something worth thinking about and hashing out there. So before we jump into looking at these texts, let's do a little bit more ground preparing. What can we actually say about Plato's views on this emotion of anger? So as I mentioned, there's no systematic treatment of anger or thumos in Plato's dialogues outside of this framework, we could say, of the tripartite soul that we're getting in the Republic, supplemented by the Timaeus and by the Phaedrus, which we're going to look at next time. But anger is definitely something of concern to Plato, right? So we see that characters within dialogues are concerned, worried, trying to prevent anger from taking place, as well as getting angry themselves. And why? Well, because, by Plato's time, they realized that anger can lead to being out of control, to making morally bad decisions or foolish decisions, getting yourself into conflict that's unnecessary. Plato is writing against the background of an entire culture that's been thinking about anger in, non-systematic ways, but depicting it in the case of people like, Achilles, for generation after generation after generation. So there's that background there. We can also say that anger, along with other problematic or disruptive emotions, the Greeks were particularly worried about envy, phthonos, but, we could also talk about fear, excessive desire, this desire to always be right or to conquer other people. These can lead to all sorts of issues within relationships, within a household, within the larger society, and we could say within the world in general. So Plato is interested in and concerned with anger, but he's not going to single it out so much as something, to write a particular dialogue on. You notice there's no dialogue on anger or even on the virtue that's often associated with managing your anger, praotes, right? This calmness or gentleness. And we can ask with Plato, as with other authors, well, why do you think it's important that we understand anger? And Plato's answer would be a bit different than some of the later authors that we're going to be looking at. I think that Plato's answer would be something like, well, so we can use anger rightly and productively for, the proper purposes that we have it for, and avoid falling into it when it's not helpful and, making mistakes because of that. So this is not Aristotle's answer. Aristotle's answer would include something like, well, the person, the rhetor, the psychologist needs to know how to awaken anger in people or to mute it, how anger actually works. You need to have a more or less scientific understanding of this emotion. Aristotle also says, that somebody who's interested in biology or physiology would be interested in anger for other reasons and would have a different viewpoint on it. And then we could talk about, the ethical stuff. The Stoics coming later would say we need to understand anger because anger is inherently bad and we must root it out. And here's all the techniques to do that. That's not Plato's point of view. Plato doesn't think that anger is intrinsically or inherently bad. As a matter of fact, not only can it be not bad, in some cases it's actually quite good and even needed. So, telling when those cases are, that's the tricky part. So let's look at the instances in Plato's dialogues where people get angry, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of Q&A and discussion, and then move on to the lessons that we can draw about how does anger actually work. So notice, again, that we can make a mistake and read anger into the Platonic texts where we can't really be sure that it's there. We attribute it to characters when there isn't any mention of it in the text. And I think, this is a bit of a digression, but I think this is very analogous to how people today read anger into all sorts of other people's discourse, behavior, attitudes, actions, when we can't be sure that it's actually there. So, for example, in online discourse, this happens all the time. I may have somebody say something that's a little bit boneheaded and, a little bit full of themselves as a YouTube comment, and then I'll respond, well, no, you've got Plato wrong there. You probably want to go and, read the texts rather than just opine about this since you're off base. And they'll be like, why are you getting angry with me, bro? And, I'll be like, well, that's a weird thing to assume. If I'm not actually, if I was writing in all caps or something, okay, that stands for being angry, right? Or emphatic. But there's no necessity to read anger in where it doesn't exist. I think that a lot of this is people projecting their own lack of emotional intelligence or, their own problems with anger onto everybody else. They assume, well, if you're correcting me, you must be doing it out of anger because that's the way I behave, right? And I think this is very common with many other things. We could talk about fear, we could talk about desire, we could talk about all sorts of other emotions. So I'm not singling that out, but we don't want to do that with Plato's text. We want to be careful as readers so we're not injecting something that isn't actually there just because we happen to interpret it that way. So what do we have? Well, I think we can break it down into three interesting sets of stuff. So there's the whole drama of Socrates being put on trial because of the activities that he engages in, philosophical activities in Athens with his fellow citizens. You may remember from the Apology that he talks about having older accusers and younger accusers. So in the Meno, as I've mentioned already, we have one of the younger accusers show up. His name is Anytus, and along with Miletus and Lycon and a few others, he is bringing the charges against Socrates for corrupting the young and impiety. And we get to see that Anytus himself is an angry guy. He shows up in the middle of this dialogue between Socrates and Meno that, if you haven't read, you should check it out. It's worth checking out. And he comes in right at the end when they're discussing whether any of the great men of Athens are able to teach virtue to their kids. And the evidence that they don't really understand virtue, that they've just been kind of lucky, had right opinion, is that they're, Pericles, his kids turn out bad. And we see this not just with, previous examples, but contemporary examples. Anytus is convinced that any good guy in Athens can teach virtue. Socrates, shows that there's good reasons for us not to think that's the case. And Anytus then says, as he's angrily leaving, you better watch it, Socrates. That sort of thing is going to get you in trouble. So he's threatening retaliation, right? And he's saying other people are going to get angry at you the way that I am. And that's indeed what we're going to find, right? In the Euthyphro, which comes right before the Apology, Socrates says that he's fine with people laughing at him. Now, this is going to come up in other places as well, but he's really concerned about the Athenians becoming angry with him. And the word there is thumontai, having thumos, having anger directed at him. And he says, I don't know how things are going to turn out in this case of mine. Now, he goes in the Apology, and he gives a speech that you could say, and we don't actually have, some textual evidence for this, but you could say, boy, that speech seemed really set up well to piss people off. He begins by saying, I'm not going to be like the rest of you schmucks and bring my kids in here to cry and stuff like that. I'm just going to present the facts. I'm not going to talk in a normal like law school, legal court kind of way. I'm just going to talk the way I'm used to talking. And then, there's other points where he's kind of zinging the audience, right? Where, for example, he is convicted and now they're deciding what his penalty ought to be. And he suggests to them, I do so much good for you that you should give me free meals for the rest of my life. So he's to some degree, it looks like he's antagonizing the audience. Now he comes in, and you all remember he gives this speech where he says, I've got younger accusers. He'll actually cross-examine one of them and make him look like a fool. And I've got these older accusers. And these older accusers are the ones who I really have to fear, because they've been saying things to you that are untrue about me for years and years and years. So you, the jury, are prejudiced against me. And I don't know how much of a defense I can make, but I can at least tell you how things happened. And well, what is how things happen? He tells this crazy story about, he's on a mission from God. And I won't go into all the details, but the mission from God consists in going around and questioning people who are supposed to be wise. So, he goes after the politicians, the political leaders, right, or would-be leaders of the state. And when he asks them questions about justice and prudence and things like that, turns out they don't actually know what it is that they claim that they know. And they get ticked off with him. They don't like that, right? And so, he uses this word apechthei, right, to denote that. And then he goes to the poets and he does the same thing to them. They don't actually know what they're talking about. You can see a nice example of that in his dialogue, the Ion, where he's talking not to a poet directly, but to an interpreter of poetry, the rhapsode Ion, this really sweet guy who doesn't get angry at Socrates. But if he was a different kind of, rhapsode or poet, maybe he would. And then he goes to the craftspeople, doctors, plumbers, carpenters, shoemakers, pick whatever you want, right? And he shows that they know one thing well, but they don't know the other stuff well. And when they get outside of their proverbial lane, they are ignorant. And so how do people respond when you show quite publicly that they're ignorant? They don't like it. And so they get mad at him. And then they're more liable to believe these lies that people like Aristophanes tell in several different plays, and other people are saying about this Socrates guy. And so that's part of the story there, right? in the ongoing drama, we have the Credo, and interestingly, in the Credo, Socrates introduces this character of the laws and the commonwealth of Athens, right? And they're going to talk to him, and he's saying, Credo, listen to what they're saying here. And the laws tell him that you're more bound to respect and placate, that is, reduce, right? Deal with your country's anger than your father's anger, implying that Socrates' country, or his city-state, Athens, is ticked off with him. And he says, if you cannot persuade and placate it, then you have to abide by its judgments and punishments, namely your death sentence. And if you don't do that, you're a bad guy, Socrates. So with the city being angry with you, what you should have done was actually mollify it rather than keep poking at it and taking the kind of stand that you did. Now, we shouldn't be too keen in interpreting these to think that we can really differentiate, thumos versus orge versus, other kinds of anger. I think we can say that, the Athenians in general were angry at Socrates for a long time in different ways that ultimately led to his conviction and execution, or self-administered execution in that case. So that we've got that going on, right? And then we've got angry people in dialogues. And who is the prime example of an angry person in a Platonic dialogue that we know is angry because Plato tells us, well, Socrates tells us that he is? Thrasymachus, this guy who is involved in a discussion about justice, and he can barely hold back his temper and barely hold back his impatience because he sees all these dummies, Socrates and, Adeimantus and, Glaucon and all these people jibber jabbering about what justice is and not actually arriving at any answer. When Thrasymachus knows what it is, and he will tell them, and he knows how valuable his knowledge is, so he expects a fee, and he expects them to sit down and shut the hell up and let him talk, right? He's an angry guy. He's not just angry at that moment. His very way of talking is angry. His character is that of an angry person. And, this is actually, interestingly, going to change a bit as the dialogue goes on. He's going to sulk, and then it's going to be mentioned again, I believe, in Republic Book 6, that Thrasymachus now has been calmed and wants to hear more of what Socrates has to say. We also have a funny story about this guy, Leontius, who gets angry with himself. This is in Republic Book 4. And he's angry at his own appetites and at his own eyeballs because he wants to look at corpses. And he's like, this is disgusting. Why am I doing this? I mean, how many of us get angry at ourselves for engaging in things that are time wasting or foolish? Think about going down a rabbit hole in YouTube or Wikipedia and being like, there's an hour of my life I'm never going to get back. What the hell's wrong with me, right? So that could happen. We also get this guy, Critias, in the Charmides, which we're not going to really go into here, but it's worth, mentioning a little bit. He gets angry because his idea gets refuted by proxy. Socrates is going after a similar idea. Chrysippus gets angry in the Euthydemus at the suggestion he would like to see this other person, Clinias, get destroyed, when instead he wants Clinias to learn. So it's sort of like saying, hey, you're not a good friend, you're not a good parent, you're not a good teacher, you're not taking care of the people that you should be doing, you're trying to wreck them instead of educate them. So he gets mad at that. In the Lysias, as I mentioned, the tutors are drunk. Now, getting drunk, kind of predisposes you to getting angry, as I think many of us know from experience. And they get angry at the crowd for not minding their own damn business and interfering. And then in the Phaedo, there's a very interesting mention there about the gods getting angry with us. Why would the gods get angry with us? Well, if we destroy ourselves, if we take our own lives, We are possessions of the gods that are damaging themselves. And so the gods would be rightly angry at us, just as if I were to be angry at my coffee cup here for somehow wrecking itself, right? So these are all examples. So that's a second class. We got the Socrates himself, and now we've got other angry people in dialogues. And then we get the third thing, a curious case. So Callicles, in the Gorgias, will tell Socrates not to be angry or upset with him. He says, kai moi maiden akthenses, right? Now, why is this so weird? Well, Callicles has just been telling Socrates that philosophy is for children, not for grown men like him. He's just had a long speech where he's like, Socrates, this philosophy stuff, it's really great. It's part of a good education, but you're not supposed to be sticking with this as a mature adult, let alone as an old guy like you. What's wrong with you? You're childish, you know? You should have abandoned that stuff and started paying attention to the things that really matter. Philosophy is an instrument, sort of like rhetoric, which is the topic of the dialogue itself. It's not the thing that you're supposed to be engaging in. You're supposed to be, competing for honors. You're supposed to be taking care of yourself and those who depend on you. He's got a legitimate complaint there, by the way. And remember, too, that this is Gorgias's own house, right? Where Socrates butted in and has shown up two of his honored guests, Gorgias and Polus, Gorgias's student. And he's made them look, well, Gorgias, he's sort of on an equal footing with, right? Polus, he's made look like an idiot. And Polus is kind of ticked off. You could imagine that Callicles would have reason to be offended by Socrates' own behavior, but he's telling Socrates, don't get mad at me for telling you this stuff. And Callicles is going to claim to have goodwill, eunoia in Greek, towards Socrates. I'm telling you this stuff for your own good, man. And then Socrates, just a little bit later, and I think ironically, there's a lot of irony in this dialogue, is going to credit Callicles with three important things. He says, I can trust you in this conversation. Why? Because you have knowledge, episteme, goodwill, eunoia, and frankness of speech, parousia. You'll tell me what's on your mind. You're not going to hold stuff back. So you're a straight shooter, buddy. I can trust you. The dialogue itself, when you're reading it, and I'd be interested in hearing people's impressions who've read it through, it seems like a very angry dialogue. And a lot of commentators have pointed this out, but the word anger doesn't actually come up, or the terms for anger don't actually come up all that often in the dialogue itself. So let's take a little pause in case anybody has any questions, comments, and then we'll jump into the second part of the session and talk about causes of anger, how anger does in fact arise according to Plato, and what lessons we can draw from that. So if you have any questions, comments about all the stuff that we've talked so far, just leave them in the chat. And, all right, well, I'm not seeing any questions or comments, so I'm going to just assume that everything is clear enough at this point. You can ask them later on, and we'll go off recording later on, and we can chat about it as well. So let's talk about what causes anger. How does anger actually arise? And Plato is not going to go into, some really deep psychology. He's mostly looking at things in terms of, well, what kind of dynamics do we observe? And this can be very helpful, I think, for us in many ways. So I mentioned before that anger often arises out of a perception that somebody else is doing something they shouldn't be doing, right? They're doing something wrong, or they're treating somebody badly, they're being unjust, unfair. This is mentioned in Plato's Republic, Book 4, as one of the things that does provoke anger, right? And this is something that we're going to see lots and lots of other thinkers take up as well. And I think that this is almost like a commonplace. Why do people get angry? Because they think that something shouldn't have been done and it hurt them, hurt people they care about, hurt things that they care about. And, Plato's not going to flesh this out quite so much as other thinkers will, but I think that's there in the background. So in the Phaedrus, as I mentioned, he discusses the tendencies that lovers have to take offense at the action or the inaction of the lover or the beloved. Why does this happen? I mean, this is something that I think we can say still goes on today when we're in a close relationship where we desire something from the other person. If they're not giving it to us, we feel like we're being treated badly. So, I'm attracted to this person. They were attracted to me. They're no longer attracted to me. Now I feel like crap. I'm questioning my own attractiveness or desirability, and I start getting mad at them, right? Why did you change? Somebody says that they're going to meet us for a date, and they show up an hour late, and we actually, like a bunch of schmucks, sat around waiting for them, and they come in, and then they're like, oops, I got another date. I got to go. Ooh, that'll really make somebody mad, right? So there's all sorts of things along those lines. And we could talk about other similar disappointments, not just in the world of love, but maybe in the workplace. We've been told that we're a valuable employee, so important to the organization, and we're going to, get a promotion anytime soon. And then we see somebody else getting promoted. And we're like, what the hell? What's going on here? I thought you said that I was, you were going to promote me, well, no, we had other needs in the company. This happens all the time, right? So there's a lot of other instances, I think, where we can read this in, his discussions about people getting angry at being shown up. We see this coming up, by the way, in Republic Book 5. He says people who possess mere opinion rather than knowledge, they get angry with the people who are showing them when this is revealed or demonstrated. This is exactly what Socrates did, as discussed in the Apology, to his older accusers, right? So we can read that in there and say, yeah, they're angry over that sort of thing. I mean, we see other dialogues where people are seemingly getting upset with Socrates for making them look foolish or like they don't know what they're talking about. But we also see dialogues where that doesn't happen, where it's quite interesting. In the Euthyphro, so now we're going to start to get to some of the real meat. In the Euthyphro, there's a really important discussion that takes place. And this is early on. And I think that a lot of people miss this because they're too interested in getting right to the Euthyphro dilemma, which doesn't come up quite the way that people interpreted it later on in the dialogue itself. And this is, you could say, one of the lead-ups to the Euthyphro dilemma. So Euthyphro had defined piety or holiness as what it is that the gods love. And impiety, by contrast, is what it is that the gods hate. So then the question comes up, do the gods actually agree on what is lovable and hateful? And it turns out that if we look at Greek mythology, clearly not. I'll give you one prime example, which comes up in the Odyssey. Hephaestus, the smith god, he's married to Aphrodite. He seems to think that marriage and fidelity are important things, right? His wife, Aphrodite, not quite so much. Goddess of love. She gets together with Ares, his brother, god of war, and they have sex, enjoy themselves. And Hephaestus now is pretty ticked off about that. And he does, creates this net. You may know the story and all that. Clearly, they're not all on the same page about marriage, adultery, fidelity, these sort of values, right? So they disagree about certain things. And so, when we look at that, we can say, what are the things that we have disagreements about? And the answer is, for us human beings, and presumably also for the gods, all sorts of things. Now, what agreements can we settle pretty easily? If people disagree about math, right? Let's say accounting, how to figure out what your costs are, what your cash flow is, what, who you need to invoice, how much for, what you need to do for your taxes. That's, that can be a little complicated sometimes, but it's pretty straightforward. And if somebody wants to argue with like really, really basic arithmetic, like somebody wants to say, I think everyone else says that 2 + 3 = 5. I think it's 6. You're like, well, you're nuts. Get the hell out of here. You don't have a role in this discussion. So it's not like calculation or things like that we get really upset with each other about. I mean, people get mad and frustrated when they can't figure out a problem, but that's a different issue. What kind of disagreements, what kind of diaphora do we have that produces hatred and anger? So the gods and human beings differ, and they can't resolve their differences easily about what we can call moral qualities. And this is something that comes up over and over and over in the Platonic texts, these different, let's call them ranges of value. The just and the unjust, the dikaya and the adika, right? That's one thing. We could translate that as the right and the wrong, or the, following the rules and not following the rules, however we want to parse out justice and injustice. The good and the bad as such, the agathon and the kakon, right? The noble and the base, or the beautiful and the ugly, or the fine and the foul, these terms that I'm throwing out there, they all translate the kalon and aischron, sometimes also honorable and dishonorable, right? So now we've got 3 ranges of value. And we could also talk about other things, the pleasant and the unpleasant, the useful and the harmful, right? These are all modalities of value. And people and the gods disagree about what these actually are and how to apply them in specific cases. And when they disagree about these things, they get angry with each other and they can develop into hatreds, conflicts. Why? Why would this be the case? Well, we find that there might be an assumption going on. Can you imagine how screwed up somebody has to be possibly saying that this is okay, this is just, and then you look at it from the other person's point of view and they're like, oh, well, can you imagine those jerks over there condemning me for defending this thing over here that's just? We do disagree about these incredibly important moral qualities, and those disagreements are places where anger arises, anger and hatred. In the Gorgias, moving on, there's this discussion that Socrates has early on with this guy Gorgias. Gorgias has just been saying that rhetoric can be used for good or for bad. It's not, the fault of the art or the teacher if somebody does use it for bad. And Socrates then says to Gorgias something kind of interesting. He says that speakers often, when they're discussing something that they disagree about, they often can't define the topic of the debate, right? It says, epicherosin dialegestai diorisamenoi, right? So diorisamenoi, to put boundaries, to define, right, around something. And they're having dialogue with each other, dialegestai. They're not just talking legestai, they're having engagement with each other. And the epicherosin, putting their hands to, deciding to, engaging in dialogue. So speakers often can't define the topics that they're discussing. And this, keeps them from being able to teach and learn with each other. He uses the word mathontes there, learning, right, being a student, and didaxantes, heautus, mutually teaching and learning from each other, which is what a dialogue ideally would look like, right? So what happens when this is the case? Well, we often attribute bad motives, bad attitudes, bad assumptions to the other person. We think that the other person doesn't communicate rightly, orthos, correctly, or clearly, sophos, in this discussion that we're having, in the debate, literally, the amphis betos sosin, right? So taking different sides, the amphi is both, right? Or putting two things apart from each other. And so because they think the other person isn't speaking rightly or clearly, they get angry, right? Halapainusi is the word that's being used there. They become difficult, they get angry, they get bristly with each other, and they think that the other person is speaking with malice or jealousy, even, we could say, kataphonon, towards them. The other person is being unfair in the discussion, in the debate. And so what's motivating the other person? What are they attributing to them? They're more aiming at winning. They're motivated by philonikia, this desire to be right, this desire to triumph, this desire to set oneself over other people, to win the contest. They're more motivated by that than they are at investigating the matter that they're supposed to be talking about. So we could say they're arguing in bad faith. They're arguing with an agenda, not the agenda, the right agenda of seeking out the truth together. And if one person is, thinking that they're being a good argument partner and that the other person is taking advantage of the situation by trying to just win, they get angry. They don't like that. Understandably so, right? And I think we can look back at our own experience and say, yeah, this kind of this tracks, doesn't it, right? Maybe we've also been the person who's striving to win and be right rather than actually be in touch with the truth at some times. I know that's certainly been the case for me. And he says, this can often lead to all sorts of shameful spectacles and abusive language. He uses this term, loidoreithentes. Loidoros is abuse, right? Calling people names, saying all sorts of bad stuff about them, implying that their motives are no good, right? And so is this a dynamic that we do in fact see? Now we've got two, right? The Euthyphro dynamic, we can call it, of disagreement about what moral values are and how they're applied, disagreement about how the discussion ought to go and whether the other person is arguing in good faith or not, or investigating in good faith. And then we have a third one, which is coming from the Protagoras. So this is put in the words of Protagoras, who is Socrates' interlocutor in this dialogue. And Protagoras makes a claim that seems to go against the Euthyphro dynamic here. So he says that when a person makes a claim to a skill like, say, flute playing, if they don't actually have that skill, then now remember back to what we were saying earlier. We either laugh them down, right? So we ridicule them. We're like, look at this jackass here pretending like he knows the flute. He doesn't know anything, right? Or we get angry at them. The word there, halapainusin, right? We get irritated with them, right? We make trouble for them. I'll just remind you. So Socrates had said that he would be cool with people people laughing at him, finding him ridiculous. It was people getting angry with him that he's worried about, right? So here we see these two things coming up in a totally different dialogue. Protagoras claims that when it comes to like justice and political wisdom and virtue, everybody's got a little bit of this, and we really want people to be trained in this. So when people come into the assembly or the law courts, or pick wherever you want, and they're talking about this sort of stuff, we don't really get angry at them. We let anybody make whatever claims they want to, right? Now, that seems to go against what we saw Socrates actually getting Euthyphro to admit in the Euthyphro. So that's probably wrong. That's probably wishful thinking on Protagoras' part. If we think that people are making claims or to skills or knowledge that they don't actually have, could even be to stuff that we don't understand, right? We're going to get angry at them because we think, who the hell are you to be talking about this, taking up space? You know, why are you putting yourself forward as an authority when you don't know a damn thing, right? We say things like that. So I think that that is another interesting dynamic. Again, we don't have like a great depth of psychology coming from Plato on this, but we could like figure out what the guiding assumptions might be. And we have these three dynamics now, all of which pertain to interactions with other people about things that we think matter, right? Moral values, discussions of topics and seeking out truth. And then finally, who's actually got the credentials? Who's got the skills? Who's got the knowledge or qualities? There is one other thing that comes up in the Protagoras that I do want to bring up. We could call this a fourth dynamic, right? He says that we don't get angry at people for faults that we think result from nature, physis, or chance, touche, just randomness, right? So, you know, what are examples of that? Being ugly, you know, if you're born ugly, you're kind of stuck with it. This is before plastic surgery, right? Or being little, you know, being too short, or being weak, having physical ailments or stuff like that. He says we don't get angry at people. Oudes thumontai. Nobody would get angry with another person over this. Now, of course, we could say, yeah, but people do get angry over that sort of thing all the time and blame those people. Well, sure, this is Protagoras talking. But Protagoras says, and I think this is something we can say he's probably right about. When it comes to qualities, good qualities that we're supposed to develop through care and practice and instruction. So I want to pause on those words. Out of epimeleia, like paying attention to things. Out of practice, askeseos, right? Out of training or discipline. And out of instruction, didaskes, learning, teaching and learning. When it comes to these good qualities that we're supposed to have, like, for example, justice, when people lack that, we get angry at them. It says, thumoi gignontai. We become angry people with them when we realize that they are lacking it. Why? Because it's their own damn fault, we think. Why did you turn out the way that you did? Well, maybe you didn't get the instruction, but you could have actually paid attention to yourself, epimeleia, right? Or you could have done some practice. And we think that people are responsible for the kind of people that they've become. I think that this tracks, again, and I'd be curious to see what everybody else thinks about this as well. So what implications can we draw from what we've been talking about here, what we've learned from Plato? Again, we don't have a great depth psychology being deployed here. There's no like scientific attitude towards it, as we're going to see in Aristotle, but we've identified now some very common dynamics that have to do with why people get angry with each other. So that can allow us to be on guard against each of these tendencies. We can look at, when we start getting a little bit hot in a discussion with somebody because we disagree about what the noble or the base or the just and the unjust are, we can be like, Euthyphro dynamic. Aha, maybe I don't need to be so angry with these people about that. And we can anticipate other people's anger arising as well. Maybe we want to take on a kind of Socratic attitude. You notice that Socrates doesn't get angry with his interlocutors, even when they're being insulting towards him. He doesn't fight fire with fire. He doesn't clap back, as we say. He will, get in his zingers, and he will be ironic with them, which kind of ticks people off as well. But he has a different way of approaching people, and what does he do? He has a concern for truth. So if we think about the Gorgias dynamic that we were discussing just a minute ago, that Gorgias dynamic of assuming, the other person is just trying to win, not really motivated by things. Socrates, he doesn't do that. His interlocutors often say that to him, but he's like, no, man, let's find the truth in this. And as a matter of fact, he wants to make the person, you see this in the Gorgias, his talk with Polus, he wants to make the person a witness for their own position. He's taking other people seriously. He wants to know what it is that they actually have to say about these things. And the other thing that he does that's pretty cool is he attributes ignorance or misguided opinion in place of deliberate evil to most of the people that he's talking to. Now, maybe he goes too far with that, right? Socrates has this famous idea that nobody really does evil willingly. Maybe he's wrong about that, right? Maybe a lot of people do the wrong thing, including engaging in these dynamics and getting angry at other people and retaliating because of, mistaken opinions on their part or ignorance of what the good actually is. So that's, just some suggestions. I think we have to be careful with those. We shouldn't adopt those as like an absolute blanket policy. Another thing we can do, and I'm kind of, I'm going to suggest this, but I don't actually completely endorse it myself, would be to do what Socrates does with Callicles in the Gorgias and attribute to people good qualities like knowledge and goodwill, eunoia, being properly disposed to other people, and frankness of speech, parrhesia. I'm a bit conflicted about that because I think a lot of people from a Platonic perspective don't actually have knowledge. Socrates is probably being a little bit ironic in attributing knowledge to Callicles or really any of the interlocutors in that dialogue, the Gorgias. But, maybe we should give people more the benefit of the doubt, at least at first, right? If they display themselves as being ignorant, bigoted, contentious, okay, maybe then, they don't have goodwill. Maybe then they don't have knowledge. Maybe they're not even being frank in speech, right? Another thing that we could say is, possible, and Socrates, I think, is a good example of this. In Republic Book 6, Socrates is going to say that philosophers can model the opposite of anger, calmness, prautes, for non-philosophers in their interactions with them. So not only can they be, less liable to stir stuff up, they can actually be a good role model over time for how they ought to behave. And I'll close by mentioning that in another later dialogue, the Sophist, there's mention of a person who is dialectically questioned, getting angry, and they get angry about lacking knowledge, but they get angry not at the other person who's showing that they lack knowledge, they get angry at themselves for lacking that knowledge, which is kind of like the Protagoras thing that we noted just a little bit earlier, where we get angry at those who didn't develop themselves properly and are stupid or bigoted or foolish or, things, they have qualities that they should have done themselves. So in the Sophist, the person who's being dialectically questioned could be like, oh man, yeah, I'm off base. It's me that's the problem. And then you can get angry at yourself, which results, according to Plato, in being more calm or gentle towards other people. Realizing that you've got it wrong can help you not be as angry. Again, is this a universal? Maybe not. Maybe there has to be a certain development of character in order for that to take place. But I think these are some useful implications that we can draw, some lessons from Plato. So before we open things up to Q&A, welcome to June and Mark, who got here a bit late, I think in part because not taking account of the fact that America went on to daylight savings time you might be angry for missing part of the discussion. We're just actually close to the end of the session. But so we've talked about places in Plato's dialogues where we see people getting angry, where anger is being mentioned. We've talked about these, dynamics that we can call out and use as lessons about our own anger, other people's anger, maybe used to some degree for some guidance. Next session, we're going to be going deeper into Plato's ideas, and we'll be doing so by looking at Republic Book 4, also 2 and 3, where, let's call it the thematic person is being discussed. How do you keep them from going bad, right? And we'll also be looking at the Timaeus and the Phaedrus, where this tripartite soul is discussed. And if we have the time, we'll maybe look at the laws as well. So, but we've got a good start on Plato here. So let's open it up for any sort of questions, comments, ideas that people have about that. Yeah, Mark and June are the time switch can be quite frustrating, right? It's in international stuff. It's always going to be a bit weird, especially when we're talking about not just America to Europe, but also, say, to the Southern Hemisphere, South America, Africa, Australia, places like that, where people are coming on and off daylight savings time. This is actually something that people can get quite frustrated about. As a matter of fact, I'm going to use this as an example. So, we talked a little bit earlier about what is it that people get angry about, right? And in the Euthyphro, mathematics and calculation are not something people get angry about. Daylight savings time can be very, very confusing. And we're springing forward, leaping back. How's this working? What's going on with what time zone? I think people can get quite frustrated when it comes to matters of what seem to be simple mathematics, when it's tied to complex matters that we can't quite wrap our heads around. Like when you look at a spreadsheet and you're like, these numbers don't add up. What the hell's going on here? Is this creative accounting, as we call it, right? So that's something well worth thinking about. All right, so we got some questions from Jamie. Do you think there's a relation between knowledge and anger in Plato's text, and how does this connect to Plato's theory of forms? So there's really no connection to Plato's theory of forms, and the connection to knowledge, you could say that there's a couple different connections to knowledge, or to the lack of knowledge. So people get angry when they think, as we mentioned with the Protagoras, people are claiming expertise that they don't actually have. They can be laughed at, or people can get angry at them. When people are revealed to lack knowledge, then they often get angry as a response, as well, as we saw happens with Socrates and is mentioned in the Republic as well. And so, we get angry at people who talk in ways that we could say seem ignorant to us, right? Now, we could be wrong about that, right? Like Anytus getting angry at Socrates when Socrates is saying, listen, all these people that we think are virtuous, they don't actually understand virtue. They don't know what virtue is. They have at best right opinion. And Anytus is like, that's bullshit. I'm angry now. You better watch out, Socrates. So, the connection between anger and knowledge isn't that straightforward and simple. I guess you could say that people get angry over claims about who actually has knowledge and who's seeking knowledge. So Jamie also says, could you say if everybody would have all the knowledge, people would no longer be angry? Yeah, trivially so. I mean, that's never going to be the case. So that's like a hypothetical of a hypothetical of a hypothetical. Plato doesn't think that'll ever be our situation. You could say that, let's say we restrict it to like the philosophers and the gods, as we find things depicted in, say, the Phaedo or the Phaedrus. There won't be any anger among them. because they are all like, inhabiting this wonderful existence outside of the body. And, there they are seeing the forms. They're also like engaging with each other. So, they, that little commonwealth of gods and human beings, that would be lacking anger. But in human affairs, we're going to have anger arising. And it's not just through a lack of knowledge. There's all sorts of other things. As we're going to see as we move on to the Republic, there's a part of ourself that gets riled up, right? And we need that part in order to get things done, according to Plato. All right, Mark says, I know this wasn't in the reading list, but in preparing for this session, I was thinking of the discussion in the Euthydemus and how the display of euristics eventually devolves into the brothers insulting the other's fathers. It seems they believe victory in dialogue requires inciting anger in their interlocutor and banking on that anger, derailing their logic. Yeah, I'd say that's fair. And interestingly, when we get to Aristotle later on, he mentions on sophistical refutations, if I remember right, that sort of strategy of like getting your interlocutor ticked off, so then they say stupid things, right? They forget their train of thought, right? So I think, there's something to that. I think as well, there's a kind of social status or capital or whatever you want to call it that comes with pointing out that the other person is angry. And, we're like, well, you're losing it, bro. Why so angry? And it's implied that if somebody is getting angry, then it's because they're losing the argument, right? And that might not be the case at all. I mean, somebody might get angry because they put forward a good position, well argued, and the jackasses that are supposed to be listening to it are just acting like jerks, acting like trolls, right? I think a lot of trolls do that sort of thing. And I think that we could see some of, not all of, but some of the sophists as being kind of like trolls, again, not all of them from ancient times, but yeah. So Mark says the "you mad" meme. So I think there's something definitely there. June says, is Socrates bringing out frustrations that ultimately result in anger? So that's an interesting question. And I would say yes, but I want to unpack that a little bit. So we can get angry for a lot of different reasons, right? Anger is not a very simple emotion. And if we're already frustrated in trying to understand a complicated topic and we're not making as much progress as we'd like, so we're conscious of our own lack of full knowledge about something, right? And then somebody else comes along and seems to be, like poking at us or making fun of us or being ironic, as Socrates is. Ooh, you're so smart. Why don't you tell me all about this thing? And we're like, well, all right, here's my theory. And then Socrates knocks it down. You're already frustrated, right? And now that frustration can move right into and fuel anger against the target, the person who's actually calling you out and making you look foolish or stupid, right? So I think that can sometimes be what's going on. And if you think about Socrates' trial, right? There's a lot of frustration in Athens. Yeah, okay. June says like hitting a raw nerve. That's a great example. So in Athens, they have gone through years and years of warfare, ups and downs, some catastrophes. This guy Socrates has been associated with people who, like Alcibiades in particular, who really played a role in screwing things up. So, a lot of people were probably like, yeah, that guy's got it coming, and now he comes into the court And he says, I'm not going to be like the rest of you schmucks and, have my kids cry or make an argument like this. I'm just going to tell it to you as it is. And by the way, you should give me free meals for life instead of punishing me. They're ready to discharge some of that anger, frustration, perhaps even hatred against him, right? So I think there's really something there. And we could generalize this. And when we're talking about these dynamics, the dynamic from the Euthyphro of disagreeing about moral qualities and their applications, the dynamic from the Gorgias about, trying to understand difficult topics and thinking that your interlocutor is trying just to win, not to actually, or score points, as we say, not to actually engage in real dialogue with you. And the claims that people make, as Protagoras said, to expertise they don't really have, I think we're ready to be angry with them. And so that's actually a good point. I mean, I also think that Socrates manages to produce some new anger as well on the part of people that he's involved with. And some people, like Thrasymachus, are already pissed off just walking into the room, and Socrates turns out to be able, as we find out later on in the Republic, to get him to calm down, or maybe Thrasymachus exercise some self-constraint. So any other questions? These are some good ones so far. So Jamie says, in the Euthyphro, there's talk of impious actions leading to pollution. Am I correct in thinking this pollution is the gods becoming angry at humans? I mean, I wouldn't read that in, because it doesn't actually say it there. The gods could just be disgusted with pollution. The gods could be worried about it. I don't think there's a reason to just read one particular emotion into that. And the concern that Euthyphro has, he's kind of a fastidious guy when it comes to that, perhaps more so than the rest of the Athenians. He thinks he knows all about, the gods too. All right, so Mark says, sorry if this was discussed earlier, how do you understand the connection between anger and the thumos? Plato doesn't seem to have a notion of righteous anger, but if the thumos has a defensive role as linked to the guardians, would anger be a healthy emotion in relation to that psychological faculty? The example I like to think of is a mother who gets angry at seeing her child being hurt and responds to it in a spirited manner in their defense. Yeah, totally. I mean, Plato thinks that, so the thumos is the part of us that gets angry. It's how it's described in Republic Book 4. So it does other things as well. It's not just getting angry. It's also desirous of honor. It's the energy that we need in order to do things. But anger is a big part of it. It's also the part that, can be developed into courage, or where defective cowardice can happen. I wouldn't say that Plato doesn't have a notion of righteous anger. It's just not articulated as such, the thumos that is directed against enemies in the Republic, as we're going to talk about next session, that would be easily to describe as righteous anger. I mean, we do have to be careful. Anger does have to remain within constraints that rationality is giving it, the higher part of ourselves, right? But Plato doesn't think that anger is, automatically bad the way that some later thinkers will. And he thinks that it has, when guided correctly, it has its proper roles. So yeah, that's something we'll talk much more about in the next session. A lot of the dynamics that we're looking at here, anger is not particularly productive, getting angry at people because they view the good, the beautiful, the just differently than you do doesn't seem to be particularly helpful. Getting angry at interlocutors that you think aren't arguing in good faith and are just trying to win. I mean, if it leads you to doing something like saying, well, this jackass, we're not going to have any productive conversation, block, right? then I think Plato would be cool with that. I don't think he would say that you want to become a blockaholic, and indulge that all the time. Anytime somebody crosses me, I block them. I don't think he'd go for that. But, Plato's not a Stoic, right? Anger can and does, when properly developed and guided and directed, serve useful roles in our lives, he thinks, and within our society. So, we do need guardians to engage in that. But there's always the danger of them, going astray. And again, we'll talk about that more in the next session. Any other questions, comments people have? Oh, from Mark, do all the fake quotes on Facebook make you angry? Not just Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, there's whole YouTube videos full of fake quotes. No, they don't make me angry. I think that it's unfortunate that people who are, like trying to make a buck or establish themselves, get some social clout, are circulating around quotes that, if they knew anything about the author, they'd be like, well, that doesn't sound like Aristotle at all, or that doesn't sound like Plato at all. They wouldn't say that sort of crap, But, I think we're now at the point where there's so much of that stuff out there that it's going to be, we're never going to put an end to it, right? So I do videos and I call out people when they engage in fake quotes, in part because I think truth matters. What I do get upset with are the people who are like, well, it's still a true statement, even if they didn't say it, or how do you know they didn't say it? And I'm like, you dumbass. I mean, you just showed that you don't care about the truth at all, because you're perfectly willing to falsely attribute something to a famous author so that people will think that you're smart or important or something like that. I mean, these are signs that somebody is, to use the Gorgias stuff, not working in good faith. They're not interested in truth. They're interested in something else, like being the big shot, this philonikia, right? And so then, if people have responses like that, I usually just block them, because there's not going to be any productive conversation with them from that point on. And I've made the point that I wanted to make, that it was a fake quote, and other people can decide what they want to do with that, So, I mean, we should ask ourselves, if we're going to think in these Platonic terms and not say more extreme positions on anger, like that of, the Stoics or some of the early Christians like John Cassian, what's worth getting angry about? Somebody being wrong on the internet, that's probably not worth being angry about, right? Because as Seneca points out in On Anger, if you're going to get angry about one thing and you're just, you should get just as angry about the next thing. And the wise person will be angry all the time then, because people are saying and doing stupid things all the time, right? Plato would probably, be willing to say you can get irritated, that's thumos, but maybe don't get so angry at people where you're out of control and you're hammering away on the keyboard. I can't believe you, SOB, or something like that. June says the emotion anger stems from thoughts. Yeah, it stems from thoughts, but not just thoughts alone. It has a root in our psychology and in our body even. And it's something that's interpersonal, and, we learn through culture and all that sort of stuff. So thought plays an important role in it. And this is something too that I think is quite important. So a lot of people view the emotions as not involving thought, as being what we call non-cognitive. And that's clearly not right. And the ancient philosophers thought that we do have a lot of cognitive aspects and components to the emotions we feel, whether it's anger or fear or joy. It's not just something that happens to us and we don't have any ideas going on, right? So there is a cognitive aspect to it, and that's very important. And like June points out, I suppose it comes from your own values and beliefs of right and wrong. I mean, nobody has their own values and beliefs of right and wrong. We do share them with other people, and we've gotten them in significant part from other people. But there is variance, like we pointed out with the Euthyphro dynamic, right? Even the gods disagree, according to Socrates, about what's right and wrong, good and bad, beautiful and ugly. So that's, that's quite true. There's a value component, there's a cognitive component, there's an affective component, there's all sorts of things all coming together in emotions. I think a lot of people want emotions to be simpler than they are, and that's kind of a recipe for getting emotions in other people wrong and getting off track in your own emotions. Emotions are really complicated. And it's good to recognize that. And to go back to Plato, people like Plato can, without providing us with a complete theory of this emotion, certainly give us some useful guidance to make sense of it. Well, we're getting close to the end of the time that I've got allotted. Mark says, bit of a broad question. Any thoughts on how Plato's anger at what happened to Socrates and Athens at large influenced the writing of his dialogues? We don't know that Plato was angry at what happened to Socrates. We know that he didn't like it, but I haven't seen some record that said Plato was angry at this and therefore he did this. And I don't think we know that about Xenophon either, who also writes an apology and symposium and other Socratic dialogues as well, or the other dialogue writers that we know wrote dialogues that we don't have anymore. In a way, that would be the sort of thing like Nietzsche would say that, Plato's resentment against the ill treatment of his teacher led him to, like retaliate with dialogues or something like that. I don't know that that's the case. I will say too, it's quite interesting. Antisthenes prosecuted Miletus, and if I remember right, Anytus as well. But we don't know that he did it out of anger either. We know that he thought that what they did was unjust and foolish, but we don't know that anger was actually involved there. We could maybe read it in if we want to, but that's on our part, reading it in, right? Saying, well, I would be angry, or people in general would be angry if their teacher was unjustly executed. So therefore, we're going to read that into Plato, but we don't know that that's actually the case. So, well, any other questions, comments? All right, well, I'm not seeing any. So I'm going to say thanks to everybody for attending and for the great questions and comments. We'll be picking up Plato again next session. And there we're going to look at the Republic and the Timaeus, the Phaedrus, and talk about the tripartite soul.